Welcome to the France 4 debate, La Francophonie, the French-speaking countries. Emmanuel Macron's unveiled his grand plan to make France the third most spoken language in the world. Let's take a listen to what Monsieur le Président had to say a little earlier in Paris.
France should be proud to be just one among many countries that learn, talk and write in French. We need to work on and strengthen that shift. The French language is often compared to a straight-lined garden. It has changed. It's a place for sharing. It has been transformed by changes across the planet.
French language compared to a straight-line garden. Maybe it'll become our own universal secret garden. We'll see. Well, currently the top three is Chinese, Spanish and English in terms of world languages. Macron's ambition is founded in far more than just chauvinistic pride. The expansion of the use of French takes with it aspects of French lifestyle. It's a way to take over the world very differently from the colonial warfare of the past. Let's take a look.
There are 274 million French speakers in the world. For France's Emmanuel Macron, speaking French opens doors in an increasingly globalized world. But what many don't realize is that there are more French speakers in Africa than Europe. In 2014, there were 150 million francophones in Africa, but less than 100 million in Europe. There's another 20 million from the Americas and the Caribbean, followed by 2.5 million in the Middle East and Asia. Finally, around 1 million are living in the South Pacific. By 2050, Africa could account for 85% of the francophone world. But according to the International Organization for la Francophonie, those numbers could change depending on how the organization's 54 member states choose to reinforce the language's teaching. With a potential for 700 million speakers, French could become the most widely spoken language in the world. But for now, it ranks 5th worldwide, behind Arabic, English, Spanish and Mandarin, with 848 million speakers.
So you get the idea how this might work. Let's bring in our guest to discuss Macron's big ambitions for the French language and beyond. Joining us by Skype from Cambridge, Massachusetts is Arthur Goldhammer, writer, translator. Arthur's translated more than 125 books from the French. He's also a senior affiliate at Harvard's Centre for European Study. Arthur, thank you, sir, for being with us. In the studio, Stephen Clark, British writer, author of MEGUERDITCHIAN, Europe, which I will hold up there. And this one, 1,000 Years of Annoying the French, something we'll elaborate on a little bit in a little bit of a time. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us. By satellite from Brussels is Asita Kanko, politician, writer and women's rights campaigner. Asita, thank you very much for being with us. Pleasure to have you there. And by Skype from Philadelphia, Gabriel Rockhill, author of Counter History of the Present. Thank you all for joining us. And can I say to you who are joining us by satellite, join in whenever you like, and I will try to make sure everyone gets a fair say. It's always difficult doing these things when people are afar, but you're very welcome, and obviously your voice matters in this discussion. I'm starting with Stephen in the studio because that's probably easier for me to handle. Good to see you, sir. Do you think Macron is taking the right kind of approach here? You know, does France have the kind of significance in the world that he clearly believes the country has?
I mean, this is nothing new. Every French president says it practically every year. You know, we've got to defend the language. But in a way, French kind of defends itself. I mean, he was at the Académie Française, which is kind of, for me, is the last place in the world that is defending the French language. You know, these 40 academicians, the ageing intellectuals, who call themselves the immortals, even though at the moment there's only 35 because 5 died, so they obviously don't understand the French word for immortal. But anyway, they're writing a French dictionary. They're writing supposedly the official French dictionary. They're only up to the letter R, which means that everything from S to Z doesn't exist yet. You know, and that's the old-fashioned version of France, which is conjured up by the word francophonie. Whereas in fact, French culture, French industry, everything French is incredibly lively. You know, I've lived here for 20 years. There's these new words coming in all the time. You know, my kids are explaining to me the difference between these slang words. There are 2 words like kéké and bolos. A kéké is a kind of a show-off, and a bolos is kind of trying to show off, but he hasn't got what it takes to show off. There's these really, subtle distinctions in new French slang going on. And at the same time, France is invading the world with its mineral water, perfume, everything, its industries, its banks. There's absolutely no worries about France and French things taking over the world. And it's just every French president suddenly seems to feel the need to talk about French language as if it needed defending, whereas it doesn't. It's a really lively, alive thing. And I mean, French culture is defended fantastically around the world. I'm incredibly jealous. I know French writers who are kind of abstract expressionist poems who no one can understand. They get invited all over the world by the Institut Français to go and give talks.
And you just get invited here to France 24.
Exactly, yeah. I get invited to the suburbs of Paris, and that's it. And if I go anywhere else, I have to, pay for myself. No, they're doing a great job already of defending themselves. It's just now and again, French presidents come out. It makes them look more patriotic when they, get up and defend the language, whether they're left or right. Suddenly, they're patriotic and everyone loves them.
Okay, I wonder if he has a plan beyond that. Stephen, thank you. Thank you so much indeed. We're learning things about slang which I didn't expect to pick up here. Great stuff. Let's bring in Art Art Goldhammer. You are in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And obviously, you have a love for the French language, sir. Do you think Macron has a grand plan, or is it just something that is kind of like the Emperor's new clothes?
I think he probably has a grand plan like all French presidents do, but the problem is to put some resources behind that plan. I spent my career as a translator, translating more than 125 books, most of which were subsidized by grants from the French government. But over the years in which I worked as a translator, the resources made available by the Ministry of Culture and other sources in France was steadily decreasing. Toward the end, I've now retired, but toward the end of my time as a translator, I found that many of the books that I translated were financed out of pocket by their authors because the subsidies formerly provided by the French government were not available. So while there are some things that France can do, and certainly having the president aggressively take up the defense of the language is one of them, it also needs to cultivate its garden, as it were, and make those resources available that allow French culture to rayonner, as they like to say, in other countries.
Cultiver le jardin. That was something Voltaire said, wasn't it?
That's right.
I hope I get him out for getting that one right, sir. Thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Asita Kanko, who's joining us from Belgium. Asita speaks, a whole list of languages, don't you? You speak English, because you're going to talk to us in English now, and you speak French.
Yes, and Dutch, like many Belgians, yes.
So in terms of the importance of French for you, where would you put it? Would you say France is a real, France or French is a real world force?
I think French was one of my first languages because, in Burkina Faso, I am originally from Burkina Faso, and we speak so many languages there, and French is the official language. So it was the language I learned at school, the first language in which I have been reading. So the first literature we are confronted with is the French literature, and beautiful literature, especially for me, Simone de Beauvoir. When you discover all the beautiful books of Stendhal, Le Rouge et le Noir was really my favorite. This is what we have been reading in the moonlight or just outside in the evening in the little villages in Africa where we did not have electricity, just to see how far a French book can go and set a mind free somewhere. And we also had access to the French International Radio, where my father got his news from. So many teachers got their news from this international radio. So I think there is a kind of power when you take a taxi in Abidjan or in Dakar. What you hear at the radio is the French International Radio. When you go home, the news you see is France 24. So I think there is a real power behind this language. And at the same time, it gives power to access information that is useful and that is maybe different from what you can expect mostly, sometimes from your local news. Especially when I was growing up, it was important to have also objective news from abroad. So I think also French has something chic, something romantic, something beautiful, and I understand the will, the ambition to keep French a major important language. But for me, I'm not faithful to one language. I think it's very important to open up. Like by speaking Dutch in Belgium, I can understand all the Belgian culture as someone who migrated to Belgium and became Belgian. And also to speak English and to speak foreign languages, this really helps to access opportunities. And when I imagine my mother now speaking only French and African languages, I see what she misses when I find an English-speaking joke or another joke, and we laugh, but I cannot share it on the same way with her. And then I'm like, Mom, you should really learn English. You're missing something. So it's beautiful, but it's good to combine with other languages. I would definitely encourage students to learn several languages.
Asita, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Gabriel Rockhill, author of Counter History of the Press, and joining us by Skype from Philadelphia. Gabriel, I hope you can hear me. I can't quite see you yet. I'm seeing you, hopefully, in a second. I can hear you. That's fine. Let's go ahead with the voices. That's brilliant. Asita, I was talking, I think, a little bit about the reach of the French language, hearing it via the airwaves, that kind of thing, news broadcasts, and cultural importance of things. And is that the key? Is that one of the big strong points of French, do you think?
Well, I think that just to pick up on some of the earlier conversation, that often the way in which the French language historically has spread itself throughout the world is through a project of a kind of centralized, administered understanding of what language is and how it can serve the purposes of the state and state power. And so I would like to question whether or not this idea of gardening the linguistic world, if you will, shouldn't actually be called into question in the name of looking at the ways in which there are kind of multiplicity of French languages already, and that these languages might be better served by a kind of bottom-up approach that would cultivate not only the various differences between them, but also the local languages that have been struggling with them in various ways. Because one of the problems with the idea of France kind of gardening the world of language is that then you would have a centralized state power imposing upon citizens, not only within France, but more broadly, a certain formatted notion of what language is, what proper usage is, and then laying claim to having the kind of corner of the market on that. Versus, and I believe it was Stephen who opened up with this, an understanding of language as a dynamic, socially variegated phenomenon that is ongoing, that is constantly being invented and reinvented, and that doesn't need the state to administer it. And in fact, if anything, the state administration of language, or as I was saying, this kind of gardening of the world, is part of a broad political project of unification and cultural dominance and cultural imperialism, and that we should be clear about what some of the stakes of these projects are.
So let me throw it to all four of you. Should Emmanuel Macron then be keeping out of this one? Should he be leaving things that happen organically to continue the gardening idea? Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, it does go on, you know, as you said, you know, French is such a dynamic language, it's reinventing itself all the time. It doesn't need really any real defense. It's doing its own job. It's, you know, it's out there, it's alive and changing. The funny thing for me is they always see it like in opposition to English. They always say that English is taking over, you know, Hollywood is destroying French, and, you know, these English language brands in France. Today in the French newspaper, Le Parisien, there was a big thing about French shops that are inventing English names to sound trendy, you know, like bagel shops and that. But that doesn't kill off French at all. The French absorb these words and they change them and they use them differently. You know, they use lol, like laugh out loud, you know, but they say it in a French way. It's become part of French. And French doesn't really need any centralized help. As, you know, we saw pictures of the académiciens just then, these ancient people who really don't know anything about language. When I went there to interview them 10 years ago, and they were arguing about whether to put in the dictionary this word récré, which is an abbreviation of récréation, which is kids' playtime. Every kid, every teacher in the whole of the French-speaking world uses this word récré. And they were arguing, oh no, it's too familiar, we shouldn't put it in the dictionary. You know, a real usable word, it shouldn't be in the dictionary. I mean, that's not how you get a language going. You know, it's a very strange, old-fashioned way.
These are the people
things.
who gave us mot dièse instead of hashtag.
Yeah, they tried to, like 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when marketing came out, the French tried to invent this French word called merquetage or something like that you were supposed to use, which no one did. You know, it's worked with ordinateur, which is the French word for computer. They resisted that one. You know, and they tried to stop internet, which everyone says. They tried to make it la toile, the web. You know, a French spider's web. But, I mean, the French decide for themselves. But the funniest thing, I think, is that the French establishment says we want French to be, an international language. But every time a Belgian speaks with a strong Belgian accent, or a Swiss, or a Quebecois from Canada, they make fun of their accents. You know, there's all these jokes about Belgian accents. I mean, if you want people to speak French, don't make fun of their accents.
I get accused of being from Quebec and I'm from Liverpool, which is quite strange, but there you go. We have our own accent, which is, as they say, exceedingly rare. That concludes this first part of our debate. Our other guests from Brussels, Philadelphia and Cambridge, Massachusetts will be live and taking part when we come back after a very short break. Part two of the France 24 debate. Welcome back. La francophonie, or the French-speaking countries, Emmanuel Macron's unveiled a grand plan to make France the third most spoken language in the world. World domination is probably what he's after. Let's take a listen to how some people are already learning, using, speaking French in the world.
Parler français jusqu'à maintenant, je crois, c'est un signe de ceux qui ont un certain pouvoir.
Ici à l'université, on parle français, mais avec les amis, si on veut, par exemple, manger, on parle seulement en lingala.
La langue française, c'est une langue étrangère, pour moi.
J'aime la langue, c'est romantique, c'est intéressant, et ça me fait plaisir d'apprendre.
France and its language reflected in many different accents and different voices, especially across Africa, where French is a key language there. Let's find another place where France is making an impact in Indochina, Thailand to be more exact. Our correspondent sent us a report on how French is being used there.
Ho Chi Minh, Rangoon, Singapore and Bangkok all have a French lycée with excellent academic reputation. They compete with other international schools and strengthen the francophonie by promoting the French language in the world. Some are under the authority of government agencies in Paris. Others are semi-private, like here in the Thai capital.
Tuition fees are 6,000 to 8,500 euros a year. It's 2 to 3 times less than the other international schools in Bangkok. France does give us some money. Without that, the fees would be higher.
The government is looking to reduce deficits at all levels. Funds for the 492 French schools abroad are down by 10%. That's 33 million euros, added to the loss of hundreds of teaching jobs within 3 years. Anne Genette is the elected member of parliament for French citizens abroad. She meets in Bangkok expats like this man, who can no longer afford to send his daughters to the French school.
We are the soldiers of French language, of French labour, skills and culture. We defend France just as much as our army. So why aren't our schools free for us abroad? Please answer me.
But free tuition is not an option for President Macron and his teams.
Our language and the francophonie are part of our soft power, but we lack the necessary financial means. Clearly, jobs are being cut everywhere, and for now I see no political desire to overturn that. There'll be no budget increase.
Worried teachers have staged protests across the world in recent months. The government wants to reform the Agency for French Education abroad. It feels that despite the cuts, its schools will continue to provide quality teaching.
Clovis Casali, our correspondent, a Frenchman who speaks English, I think possibly better than me, and indicative of many people here at France 24 who use not one language, but 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 in their daily routine. It is a really diverse place to be. Let me show you our guests, and they are a diverse bunch too. Joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, by Skype, Arthur Goldhammer. Arthur, you translated Émile Zola, and I think I used one of your books when I was doing my French degree at one point. So thank you, sir, very much for your help, although you didn't know you helped me at the time. Stephen Clark is a writer of a number of books, mostly with the word MEGUERD in them, and very good books they are too, sir. Thank you very much for joining us. Asita Kanko joins us from Brussels, writer, campaigner, politician, original native of Burkina Faso, now a Belgian citizen who works in at least 3 languages and probably more, which she will reveal to us in a moment. And joining us from Philadelphia, Gabriel Rockhill, author, man who counts French very dear to his heart. Gabriel, tell us your relationship with the French language.
Well, I was born in the United States and then learned French later in life, but took it quite seriously. So I moved to France, became naturalized as a French citizen, and now teach and write regularly in French.
Should the French need to do what Emmanuel Macron is doing today, try to boost the language? Does this have to happen, or should it be allowed to talk for itself? Gabriel, over to you.
Is this a question addressed to me or to,
yes, Gabriel,
to everyone in general?
I'll start with you, but everyone else can join in.
Well, okay. Well, I think that the project that Macron has announced, as some of the other speakers have also highlighted, is a kind of ongoing project of the French state, and that is to spread the French language as a way of spreading French culture and participating in the kind of ongoing legacies of French colonialism and neocolonialism, which doesn't mean then that we have to kind of throw out the French language, so to speak, but that I think that we have to be dubious concerning the ways in which it's circulated and the forces that support it. I would be much more in favor of a more bottom-up approach to languages in which we understand them as dynamic forces that don't need to be centralized, that often take on different accents, different tonalities, different intersect with different idioms, and also that don't crush local languages, because that's one of the problems when you have a dominant language that is a colonial language of the state that is imposed, is that the number of languages that are crushed by that are almost innumerable. And so I would be in favor of a more decentralized, bottom-up approach to the cultivation of language rather than the top-down centralized approach advocated for by Macron.
Asita Kanko in Brussels, tell us more about your experience growing up of the French language, about what you were hearing on the airwaves.
I would like to stress 3 things. First, when I was growing up as a child in Burkina Faso, for me, French was an opportunity to access knowledge, written knowledge, to access information, and also to share views on this information. We had these conversations on the playground as children, when some people said we should only learn Burkina Faso languages and write in our own languages. But I don't know how you can manage if you have such a great diversity of languages, how you can manage with one of them. And honestly, I was a bit worried. I really hoped we would not stop learning French and only learn one local language, because you cannot go very far. I wouldn't be able to find a job in Brussels with that. So I think we need to, there is a kind of pride one can have, and at the same time, it's important to check what is useful. For me, if learning French is very useful, I can go to many places with that, and I can access a lot of information that I need. So that is important. I really dissociate this opportunity from the historical dispute that can be in it. Also, I would like to stress one second thing. It's very important to know that when French presidents go around and speak about French, it feels differently depending on who is speaking about it and how they're speaking about it. I used to feel not very comfortable with the way in which former French presidents used to speak about the French language and about the relation between France and Africa. But I'm completely comfortable with the way in which President Macron spoke in Ouagadougou and also in other places about the new way of having a grown-up relationship with Africa, and also regarding the language. So I think it depends on what you do with the language. The language is a tool that you can use for yourself and that others can use if you want to be dominated or dominate with a language, it depends on how you make information available and how you access information, how you can use your own mind to analyze and criticize that information, and so on. So I think the story is very important and the attitude is important. Third, when we speak about having the bottom-up or the top-down approach, I think maybe this is my Belgian side as well, like the truth can be in the middle. I think we need both sides. You cannot just have an anarchy. I think language is such a beautiful thing that you need to organize it, and at the same time, the individual touch from the different accents. When I speak French, I also have my accent with my R that is really stressed, and I think I wouldn't like to lose that. It's part of the charm of every region. We also have our expressions in Belgium, and people laugh sometimes, but I wouldn't like to lose that neither. So I think we can take both to have this kind of good organization, and at the same time have the creativity of people who are using the language. And just to conclude that part, I always been a bit angry with the French language for one thing, for putting me as someone who is less important than men. First, I was 7 years old when the teacher said, when there is one boy in the room and there are several girls, we will say ils sont là and not elle. I never understood why it's not elle, because when there are several people from the other gender, why the male gender is always overruling the female gender in the French language. And honestly, in November, I wrote a letter to the brilliant French writer who passed away at the end of 2017, Jean d'Ormesson, and I asked him, why can't we find a solution to, it will be very complicated to reverse the situation, but how came that, that women are actually a bit discriminated by the French language, and how can we find a solution? Is it possible
I would never do that to you in English, I promise.
And he was
I would never do that
okay.
to you in English. But let me get the boys here to talk a bit more about that, perhaps, and bring that in. We'll move on to soft power in a moment, but let's just exhaust that issue about what Asida's talking about, the way that French is very, phallocentric, Stephen?
Well, it's a genderized language. When I first came to France, it really, or when I first started learning French, I thought, why is it la table, a female table? Why is it female, female chair, la chaise? But it's a very genderized language, so it does force these gender choices on you, and it also makes French incredibly difficult, because when you write an adjective, you have to make it feminine or masculine or plural, which is one of the things that stops French really becoming a big world language. The grammar is so difficult, and French people are so pernickety about it. Teachers, when learning French, when people start learning French, some of them just get discouraged because the grammar is so difficult. They spend their whole life learning grammar instead of ordering food and wine. Instead of doing the fun things, it's like, you can't get your subjunctives right, or your masculine and feminines right, and so it's a very genderized.
I remember there was a quiz show which one of the questions was about imperfect subjunctives. So they used like a grammar clause as one of the answers, which I think maybe sums it up. Art Goldhammer, can I bring you in to talk about that aspect, but also the broader things about French and about the idea of maybe using the language as a sort of soft power to conquer the world? But it's difficult if it's such a difficult language to learn. English has a major advantage because you can speak English relatively well, relatively quickly.
Well, I think the difficulty of learning French can be exaggerated, and English, in many ways, is far more difficult with the large number of irregular verbs. But I'd like to go back to the issue of top-down versus bottom-up views of language. I largely agree with the idea that top-down and bottom-up are complementary rather than antagonistic. My wife, who also speaks French, is a doctor who has worked in both Haiti and Burundi, and her ability to speak French has enabled her to serve as a teacher for doctors in those countries who are educated in the French language rather than in English. It gives them access to a variety of technical knowledge that would not be available to them if they spoke only the local language. So I think that the desire to spread French is not simply an imperialistic desire to perpetuate the domination of the metropolitan culture over peripheral cultures, but actually does serve local interests. So it's a complementary rather than an antagonistic relationship.
And what about, as Stephen was just pointing out here, the use of tu and vous, that distinction between familiar and polite? Is it a barrier? Is it another way of getting between people?
That distinction exists in other languages such as German, which has three versions of you. And the gender situation in German is even more complicated than in French. The word for young woman is das Mädchen, the neuter.
Indeed.
Either feminine.
That's why German is not a world language. Yeah.
Perhaps that's why German is not a world language, says Stephen.
No, but it's not the only reason, luckily for us. But it's the tu vous thing does divide people. I mean, I used to work in a big French company, and sometimes I would meet a group of people in the corridor where some of them I knew really well, so we would call each other tu. Some I didn't know quite so well, so we would call each other vous. Older people in the company would call younger people tu, but the younger people had to call them vous, and so you didn't know what to say to people. Sometimes I'd see a bunch of people coming towards me, I think, no, it's too complicated, I'm going to hide in this office, And it does, English is for that. It's so easy because it just takes away barriers between people. It's just you. And it takes away these barriers that even French people find difficult. I've seen TV interviews where the interviewer called like a star tu or something like that because they knew them, and the star sort of said vous back, and it's a slap in the face, or and so French does have this really, for other languages have it as well, but French has this very difficult thing to overcome, which is, sometimes you have a conversation in French, should we call each other tu or vous? It's a real difficult thing.
It was one of the things I learned as a child growing up. You need to ask somebody, puis-je vous tutoyer? Can I use tu when I speak to you? And the adult says yes, then you're in. You're going to get second helpings at dinner, it's great. Can we move on to talk about... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's part of...
Go ahead, Asita.
When French is spoken outside
I was saying
France,
this is part of the French charm,
Part of the French charm, says Atita. Arthur, you got cut off in your prime. Go ahead, Arthur.
When French is spoken in other
countries... I was saying it's part of this moment of doubt. Okay, I thought I was speaking.
I apologise,
I think it's part of the beauty of French language to have this.
Excuse me.
No one knows what to say now.
Now, Arthur, over to you, sir.
Okay.
I was simply saying that the two distinction is not observed in all countries. So in Haiti, for example, tu is used almost exclusively, except by the upper classes. The tu can also be used to establish familiarity very quickly. It was one of the things that people disliked about President Sarkozy, that he used, he had le tutoiement facile, as they said. He used tu very easily with people he didn't know well at all, and that was a way of establishing a quick but perhaps false intimacy.
Indeed. I wonder whether he's using tu with the police officers who he's answering questions for in the station in northwestern Paris this very evening. Let's bring in Gabriel to talk about the issue of soft power. Gabriel, I hope you can still hear us, sir, in Philadelphia. Emmanuel Macron wants to establish French as a weapon, a soft weapon, in order to increase French influence across the globe. Is this going to happen? Can this work?
Well, I think that this is an ongoing project of the French nation-state, going back to the Académie Française, of course, but then throughout the colonial period. And I think that one way of thinking about this, and to pick up on some of the earlier comments regarding the relationship between either a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach, is that we should remember that one of the reasons, of course, that French or English or Chinese or other such languages are dominant languages is because these are dominant socioeconomic powers in the world. And so learning the languages of the imperial powers does give oneself access to certain things that other local languages might not. But that doesn't mean that then, in and of itself, the historical project of top-down administration of languages in this form of soft cultural power is something that we should praise or embrace. And I would just bring up as a counterfactual example, wouldn't it be interesting if the president of France was very invested in order to kind of overcome the legacies of colonialism in teaching Arabic in French schools, or teaching African languages in French schools? Or why is it that in public schools in the United States, Spanish isn't taught across the board, right? This would be a very, very different way of thinking about how the state, because of the way in which it administers language, could not simply serve its own purposes in the kind of soft power imperial extensions in the neo-colonial era, but could instead foster different modes of relationships to languages, and that those modes could also then break down some of the top-down administration that I had mentioned earlier.
Gabriel, thank you very much indeed. Let's put that to Asita. Asita, you heard what Gabriel had to say there. I mean, do you feel that could be some way of perhaps going about it in a different way, showing France as a different way of looking at things by doing, say, what Gabriel was saying, sort of teaching African languages, or maybe sort of making Arabic, which seems to be a very logical thing to do, putting Arabic on the school curriculum?
I think like in Belgium, for example, we have 3 official languages. We have Dutch, German, and French. And I would not imagine having other languages. As a mother of a child of 10, when she goes to school, I expect her to learn Belgian languages and to learn Belgian values. So I think each country also has its environment, its curriculum, and we cannot just start doing other things. So because you have your history, you have your habits, you have a set of values that need to be continued. So for me, it seems absolutely normal to learn French when you go to a French school, and to learn Dutch, German, and French when you go to a Belgian school. So because it's Belgium, and when you go to school in Burkina Faso, you learn French, and at a later stage you learn English. So it seems completely normal to me. I think I don't feel. Yes. Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Gabriel.
Those are all the result of historical struggles
I did not hear the question.
Over time. And the reason that you learn French instead of Breton, for instance, when you're in Bretagne, is because of the history of the imposition of the French language within the school system, within the state administration, etc. And to simply say that, well, this is a natural part of culture, is just to embrace a historical phenomenon as if it was a natural phenomenon. And there's nothing natural about it whatsoever. And I think it's precisely for that reason, and given the very tense relationships between the French nation state and its former colonies, that it would be an enormous contribution to actually valorize the cultures, languages, and peoples that aren't elsewhere. They're in France. They're part of the French nation state. And that would be a very different approach, because it would then cultivate the richness of those various cultures and languages, instead of trying to expunge them in the name of the, imperial language that France is imposing.
Gabriel, thank you very much indeed. We need to stop it there. Media Watch is coming up next. Our debate guests are still with us. Stephen's got to go, I think, but can you stay for a moment? Good man. Well, we're continuing, sir. Please wait. James Creedon joins us for more reflections on la journée de la francophonie.
That's right. There's a couple of
French language days.
I harvested a few francophone tweets in English. There you go. I'm not sure, it might defeat the purpose, but
you know no limits, do you? Good man.
Just a quick look at them, because I have been looking mostly in Media Watch today about the reactions to Sarkozy, and we might get to look at a little bit of that as well. In any case, all of the kind of francophone countries have been tweeting. They're really participating online, whether it be their embassies or their ministries of culture or whatnot. There's a big effort across the francophone world to sort of push this event, which is now into its 30th year. House of Switzerland, we speak French. French is one of Switzerland's official languages with the 22.7%. That's just to give you a sense of the kind of tweets we're seeing online. That's the Embassy of Canada in Belgium, I believe, and talking about the fact that the French language does exist outside of Quebec in Canada's other territories as well. Justin Trudeau, Francophones have played a foundational role in building our country, and today, on the International Day of la Francophonie, we celebrate the French language and culture. So it's not just Emmanuel Macron, it's other leaders as well pushing this. Some then with, I suppose, slightly funnier takes on things, celebrating the International Day of the French language with this classic. Now that's, I suppose, what would you say? Well, the classic kind of headache for English speakers at least, but probably everyone, of learning French numbers when you have...
it is complicated.
67, 68, 69, 60, 10. And other languages stare back.
70.
60, 11, 12, 13, and it goes on. And then you have, what is it? It goes up to 420s. Now, they don't do that in...
Belgians don't do that. They do 70 and 90 and all that. Yeah,
I was actually in Geneva recently, where I think it's the same. And it is bizarre. You just go over the border to this, not a huge territory of French speaking, and they kind of much more logically use other words as opposed to 4 times 20.
Why do the French stick with it, Stephen?
I have no idea. And the thing is, again, they make fun of these Belgians for being so logical. I mean, it's a very easy thing to do. You know, 70, 80, 90. It's perfectly logical. It's perfectly Latin. And yet the Parisians make fun of them for doing it, which is another reason why French is spoken less in the world than it
70, 70 is 70 in French.
Right.
Belgium would be 70. Okay.
Well, yeah, I've just known with my phone number, when I get it's 84, 85.
Don't give it
92 at the end, right? It's not the whole number, but it's 380 numbers at the end, and because it's 90 something, the final one, everyone starts writing it down wrong and has to correct themselves. So it isn't very helpful.
If you want James's number, just email me and I'll sell it to you. Don't worry.
There's probably some algorithms where you can get it, narrow it down now, but don't.
Do you want to talk about Nicolas Sarkozy, James?
Yes, just a few elements on that, Mark, because he was taken into custody today, and of course it's a huge story, and journalists around the world talking about it. And I'll just a couple of snapshots of some of the buzz. I suppose Gaddafi returns from beyond the grave to haunt Sarkozy, because the accusation is that Gaddafi helped fund the 2007 campaign, allegedly, and that perhaps even the war in Libya may have been motivated by trying to erase the traces of all that. It's a hugely damaging claim.
I remember with great pomp when he came to Paris. He camped out on the Élysée lawn. He even went hunting in the forest outside of Paris, where I live. You know,
that's right.
Hunting deer, you know.
That's right. And it was the welcoming back of Gaddafi onto the international stage. Yeah. Anyway, these are the kind of cartoons we're seeing that sort of indicate that, and a lot of cartoonists have been inspired by this idea of Gaddafi's revenge from beyond the grave. But of course, presumption of innocence, it ain't over yet.
Innocent until proven guilty.
Absolutely.
James, thank you very much indeed, sir. Thanks to our guest, Stephen Clark, here in the studio, Art Goldhammer in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Asida Kanko in Brussels, Gabriel Rockwell in Philadelphia, joining us for this debate about la francophonie. That was the France 24 debate. Stay with us. More to come here live from Paris.